Welcome to the McGraw-Hill Education Webinar Series. I'm Angie Eckerly with McGraw-Hill Education, and I will be the webinar moderator for today's session, Comprehension Instruction in Open Court Reading. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you will be able to hear the presenter, but she will not be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean you cannot participate. We, of course, want to hear any questions you have, so just type those questions in the panel on your toolbar. Joining us today is Carol Christensen. For the past 20 years, Carol has been a curriculum specialist with McGraw-Hill Education. She's worked with administrators and teachers to further literacy instruction. She's been involved with many large open court reading implementations throughout the country. I'd now like to turn the session over to Carol.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session on comprehension. I know last month, many of you may have viewed the previous session on introducing the concept question board, and today we will be talking about how that will help impact comprehension instruction. The goals for today's session will be, number one, to improve students' ability to learn from the text. I think that is what's most important for our students, is understanding that their job to reading is, or with reading I should say, is not to simply finish a book, but to actually learn something from text. And that is very difficult to do. And so today we will talk about how to improve students' abilities. We're also going to engage in meaningful comprehension instruction. What should that look like in the classroom? What should that sound like in the classroom? And what we can do immediately to take those strategies back right into our own classrooms. So hopefully today you'll be able to gain some new insight in comprehension instruction. Before we begin, I want you to just kind of think about your own students and reflect on what happens when comprehension instruction is taking place. Are they fully engaged? Are they not very engaged? What happens in your own classroom? I have a poll question for you. I'd like you to think about which of the following influence comprehension. Is it background knowledge of the students? Is it setting a purpose for reading? Is it strategies to overcome comprehension failure? Or is it all of the above? I'll give you a few seconds to answer that question. Well, it looks like we have a winner here, and that is definitely all of the above. All of the above. All of the previous or all of those statements do have a very large effect on students' comprehension, and we're going to take a brief look at how each one of those is addressed in the open court reading instruction. So to start off, the first thing we're going to do is discuss pre-reading activities. And pre-reading activities, I see a variety in classrooms. Sometimes the pre-reading activities take so much time and attention that really everything that students are going to learn about the text has already been talked about. So that really kind of dismisses the purpose for reading, to learn new information. And then another pre-reading activity that I've seen actually is none at all. It's jumping right into the selection without thinking about what we're supposed to be reading. What we want to find is a nice middle ground with that. We don't want to spend too much time on pre-reading activities, but you do want to have some introductions. So here's what we see when you look at the instruction in open court reading. There are basically two things that we do before. The first one, for building background, is taking a look at the bullets that are found in your teacher's edition that provide some questions or some discussion starts to get your students thinking about what they're going to read. Oftentimes, we will talk about the genre, and that will definitely play an impact on the student's understanding. Are we reading this for entertainment, to learn a lesson, or to learn new information? And then, of course, we want to introduce some of the story and concept words. Now, some of the words from the selection will be introduced briefly, knowing that you're going to come back and review them. We don't need to go into an entire vocabulary lesson at this time. Students at the beginning, before reading, do not need to write down those words into a notebook and write sentences with those words. Those can be saved for other times. What we need to do is briefly give them some information about the words and about the concept. Understanding a concept is going to help them understand the passage, even if the word is not found within that passage. And then, of course, we want to preview the essential question. This is something that will help the students think about, what am I going to find the answer? Where am I going to find the answer in the text? The other thing that we are going to do for pre-reading activity is preview the selection. And there are 2 activities that we use, and these are fairly structured. For example, we want to make sure that during this time we are setting a strong purpose for reading. If students are reading without setting a purpose, they are not going to be as engaged in the text. They're not going to be looking for anything. How are we going to do this? We are going to browse the selection before we read. That means looking at the illustrations, photographs, headings, and text to see if we can get some clue about what we are going to read. And then we're going to keep track of that information on a clues, problems, or wonderings chart or a KWL chart. Now, looking at those 2 charts, for nonfiction text, we are going to use the KWL chart. In the classroom, when we browse the selection, we don't want it to be a complete picture walk of the entire selection. We want just a few pages. So maybe you look at the first couple of pages. Maybe you cannot go past page 86. Give them some guidelines. And students can get some information out to share with the rest of the class. It's best if this is kept on a chart or on a computer generated page that can be saved for later use when you finish the selection, to come back to our charts and see if we have any answers. Most everyone's familiar with the KWL chart, but one that is kind of unique to the Open Court Reading Program is the clues, problems, and wonderings. And this is what we're going to use when we look at fiction text. A clue is going to tell us or give us some information about what this story could be about. For example, a good clue might be, I see some characters' names, or I can tell the setting of this selection, or just by looking, I can tell the specific genre. Or I notice that, this looks like it took place in the past. I don't know much about that. That will be very interesting. So those are all clues. When you look at problems, it's not the problem within the story. It's actually, what could give me a problem while I'm reading this? Most often, those are words that the students are going to come across. For example, I will have ask students to point out any words that they're not sure how to pronounce, or even if they can pronounce it, they're not sure what it means. And we'll keep track of those. And as we're reading, sometimes we're going to have to use the text to figure out those words. And sometimes you may want to give just brief definitions. And then finally, in the wonderings category, this is where students are going to track what they want to find out from this piece of text. How does it connect to the theme? And as the teacher, you are going to have to model those wonderings. This chart begins at the middle of grade 1 instruction and continues in grades 2 and 3. Now, how much time should all of this previewing the selection take? Well, it should take about 10 to 15 minutes, and that is all. So we want to make sure we keep this moving and just enough so that the students really want to dive into that text. Because after all, they're going to learn most of their information from reading it. And most of your time should be spent during comprehension actual instruction. So let's talk about now the during reading activities. This is where you will spend a majority of your time. And this is where we may have to think a little bit differently about how that instruction should look. Basically, what we want to understand is that comprehension instruction is very explicit. It is actively engaging the students in discussing the selection. And we're going to do that a couple of times. We are first going to read the selection with the students to understand literally what the text is trying to say. And then we're going to revisit the text to dig a little deeper in that. And that's where we are going to access the complex text with comprehension skills and take a look at the writer's craft, which are techniques the author uses to make it more interesting. So let's start with the first part, and this is the most important one I want to talk about. The biggest part about comprehension instruction is teaching what happens inside a good reader's mind as they're reading new information. Now, this idea was built on Anne Brown's research on comprehension strategies. And it's going to be something that she called reciprocal teaching. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I wanted to show you before we get started, there are habits that good readers use that are problem solvers to help them get through a text that they don't understand. I've included a handout for you to download, and I'll show you an example. On the list on the screen are the comprehension strategies, and in your handout, you have the comprehension strategies on strips that can be used within the classroom. I like to use these with students to really point out and show what we are talking about. So let's start with what the strategies are. Good students summarize when they read. That means that they pick out the most important points to check their understanding. Good readers clarify. This is extremely important. That is a self-monitoring activity where students are understanding what they're read, but at the same time having a little conversation with themselves thinking, do I understand this? Or, okay, I'm getting to a part, I don't really understand what that meant. Now what do I do? Sometimes you have to go back and ask questions, or sometimes questions pop right into your head that you're wondering what could happen next, which leads to predicting. And a prediction is what could logically happen next within a text. I can't just be wild guesses. It's got to be based on what the author tells us. Of course, then we have making connections, which is one of the early acquired strategies where students can make connections from what they're reading to themselves, to the world around them, or to other texts. Visualizing will help the students paint that mental picture of what is happening. I think of like a how-to piece where we're reading some instructions, visualizing the steps will help students comprehend. If they're reading a text with very vivid description, that visualizing helps the students stay connected with their text. And then of course we may want to monitor and adjust our reading speed. That means if we're reading to learn new information, we may have to read more slowly and pay attention to what the details in the text are telling us. So I mentioned earlier before that reciprocal teaching, and that was based on Anne Brown and Anne-Marie Sullivan-Polinskar's research on fostering comprehension instruction. One thing that I always like to think about is that, every time we ask a comprehension in the text, a comprehension question from the text, we're not teaching comprehension. We're actually assessing whether the students understood what happened in the text. To instruct in comprehension, we have to teach how to think. And within Anne Brown's research, they did find a study that students who are taught how to interact with a more complex text in a more sophisticated manner will have better retention of what is read and also will be able to retain that ability as they're moving with other texts. They will learn to do the same thing. So that's why the comprehension instruction in open court reading looks the way it does. So for reciprocal teaching, students and teachers need to be engaged in discussions while they're reading. So what does that look like in the classroom? That means during the first read, the text needs to be read aloud because we're engaging in discussions in that text. By reading aloud, that doesn't mean that the teacher does all the reading, because whoever does the work does the learning. We want the students to also be doing the work. So you may want to work with students in this manner. Let's start together reading. I'll read this part. Let's have a volunteer read the next part. Everyone, let's read the next page. So you vary how the text is being read, but it needs to be read aloud so that we can discuss and engage in meaningful discussions while we're reading. Next, we are going to teach the students that the strategies are there to help us solve problems when we read. We need to know all of those strategies, and we need to know what or how they help us when we come to parts that maybe we don't understand or that we want to check ourselves. And this is done during a very specific routine. It's scaffolded in over time. Those of you that teach kindergarten and first grade, you know that you start out your comprehension instruction by reading big books. The students can be taught these strategies beginning with oral comprehension and listening comprehension, and gradually developed into reading comprehension, which takes over the middle of first grade and in second grade and third grade. This is very developmental and will vary from student to student. So we want to make sure that there are plenty of opportunities in place for students to understand them. So you begin with teacher modeling. Teacher modeling would look like this. All right, boys and girls, we have read a lot of information. So I'm going to be summarizing the main parts of this first half of the selection so we can check ourselves so we make sure we understand. The most important parts are, and then you would state them. That is teacher modeling. Teacher decides when to use the strategy. Teacher explains why they're using the strategy and uses it. Then you move into teacher prompting. Now, teacher prompting might sound like this. All right, boys and girls, we have read a lot of information. Who can summarize the most important points of this text? Then the teacher would call on a volunteer to summarize that information. Eventually, you want to get to where students are initiating the use of the comprehension strategies. Now, this would be wonderful. Every so often, as a teacher, you are going to want to stop and ask the students, is anyone using a strategy or would like to share a strategy that they're using? And you might want to get to the point where students are actually saying, you know what, we've read a lot. Can I summarize the beginning part of this story? And tell you a very good summary. That's how you know they're actually comprehending as they're reading, if they can initiate and use those problem solvers on their own. This is why a lot of time needs to be taken for this reciprocal teaching. You may not finish a whole selection in one day. It may take 2 days to complete that first read. What does it look like in the text? Well, you will see within the text numbers that correspond to the numbers at the bottom or on the side of your page, mostly at the bottom of your page, where it will list a strategy. Now, that's not a script for you to read verbatim, but it is giving you an idea of what to say when you use that strategy. You want to make sure that when you're modeling a comprehension strategy, maybe you go through and highlight in your book, what are some important points you want to pull out of that? What do you want to say? So remember, it doesn't have to be a script read. You want to make it naturally sound like it's happening within your own head. So it might get down to the point where, you know what, we I need to stop and clarify. I don't understand what the author meant by this sentence, and go back and reread it, and then discuss how you problem solve it to figure it out. Very specific feedback for the students. Your guide is going to start off the first few units saying that, or denoting a teacher model. That means you are doing the work and demonstrating for the students how you're thinking. The other instances within your teacher's guide, it will shift to something called teacher prompting. And that will say, we have read a lot of information. Can anyone make a prediction about what will happen next? Teacher prompting is a little different because you stop and decide what strategy to use, but then you will call on students to actually use that strategy for the class. So you are choosing the point in time when to stop. Now, you might want to write this down or take note of this part. Student initiation. There's not really a spot within the guide that says, stop here and ask if students are using a strategy. This is where you need to read your class and figure out, okay, are my students understanding this? Maybe I should stop and see if anyone needs to use a strategy. And if they do, praise them for that information. Remember, asking comprehensions does not teach comprehension, it assesses it. Instruction requires engaging discussion between teachers and students and teaching the students the strategies for debugging comprehension failures when it breaks down. Now, the second time we go back and read, we are going to go back and revisit the selection. You don't necessarily have to read it aloud again a second time. Go back and revisit. The first thing that we're going to look for is accessing that complex text. What makes it a little difficult? Now, there's two things that we look for. Number one, there are comprehension skills like main idea, sequencing, cause and effect, classify and categorize that authors will use to help organize information in the text. So we want to go in and point that out. Oftentimes I get questions on why there why is there one comprehension skill for one story and a different one for the next story? Well, that's because we are focusing on the text and what the author used to help organize the text. So you'll see a variety. And sometimes the authors use more than one, and that will be denoted in your guide as well. You will also be working with comprehension skills such as drawing conclusions and making inferences that help you dig a little deeper into the character or what the author wants to imply but not directly state. And again, you do not need to reread the entire selection. You may simply revisit a page and stop. You may introduce the comprehension skill first and then identify it within the text. You may ask the students to turn to another couple of pages. Now let's see if we can find it together. Where is the evidence in here? How did the author organize the information on this page? And the students might again point out whether it's classify and categorize, cause and effect, main idea, and details. And that'll help the students in their mind as they're reading, help them organize the text themselves. The other thing that you're going to look for in the second read, again, it is a revisit, but that is work looking at the writer's craft. And these are things that the author has used to kind of either spice up the selection or help aid understanding, such as text features, such as captions, headings, or diagrams. You will also find this in your teacher edition as well. It will be denoted right at the bottom of the page. There we go. And it will ask you to go back through and discuss what did the author use at this specific point. Do you have to show every single skill and revisit every single writer's craft piece? No, choose the ones and choose the examples that'll really teach your students. What does this look like in the classroom? What should the instruction look like? Well, we want to make sure that we are thinking about what happens in our own classroom. right. Having a little trouble getting the next slide or next piece up. Okay, so a couple things I want us to think about. When you're in your classroom, reflect. Who is doing most of the talking? What feedback is given to students? How are students motivated to participate in the classroom? Is it just a few students, or is it the entire class? And also I want you to think about, the last part is, how can you tell if students are making progress? Now let's think about, go back to that, who is doing the talking? I want you to think about, your goal is to be 60-40 or 50-50. That means I talk 50% of the time as the teacher, the students are talking 50% of the time. That's our goal. Give very specific feedback. For example, if you're reading a book about a service dog and a student wants to make a connection and they raise their hand and say, oh, I can make a connection. I could say, my connection is that there's a dog in the story and I have a dog too. Guide them as the teacher saying, you know what, that's a good connection. Let's make a stronger one. Tell me, how is your dog the same or different from the dog in the story? So make sure that feedback is given. Encourage the students. If they're not sure about what to say, give them some time, think time, have them turn, talk, and share, and then call on a student to share out. And then if students are attempting to use strategies, maybe not quite there, be sure to praise those attempts, because they are taking a risk and we want to praise that risk. Remember, it takes time. It takes time. It's going to be developed over time, and students need to have that support. All right, well, we've talked a lot about comprehension today. I am wondering, well, before we get to the questions, there's just a couple things I want to show you about overachievers. If you're an overachiever teacher in the classroom, you are going to make yourself a set of strategy cards, and you're going to hold them up as you use them to help the students. You're going to use the academic language, such as, I'm going to make a prediction, and encourage the students to also use that language. You're going to become the facilitator, and the students begin to solve problems as they take over the discussion. So let's think about, what do we want to do within our, and I've got slides here that I didn't know that I was going to have. While we wrap it up, are there any questions that anyone has before we move on and wrap up for the day?
How do I help my students who are struggling with comprehension and fluency, and what do you suggest?
Okay, that's a very good question, because fluent readers generally are better comprehenders. If students are struggling with fluency, they are spending their entire brain power trying to decode those words. They need to be a part, though, of comprehension lessons with a more difficult text. They need to participate in oral activities that they are listening to the selections and they're able to respond and use those strategies. As their fluency gets better, pretty soon using the strategies while they're reading themselves will increase.
And we have one more question from Mary. What strategies will help students take ownership?
Students taking ownership. That is, maybe you would like to have some discussion within the group. Encourage that, taking that ownership. For example, read a couple of pages and stop and say, who can use a strategy? If no one does, you model a strategy. Now, can anyone add with that? And the more you praise and the more you encourage, the more students will begin to participate. I see.
Thank you for attending the webinar today, and thank you, Carol, for your presentation. We will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording. Thanks, and have a great rest of the week.